Welcome to Void Histories, a quiet place where the shadows of the past are not forgotten, but gently unfolded, not as distant facts, but as living echoes of memory and loss. Tonight, we walk slowly into one of the darkest journeys in American history, the Trail of Tears, the forced removal of Native Americans. It is a story not only of land and power, but of families torn apart, of voices silenced, and of wounds that still breathe within the present. Here, we move gently through history, like travelers beneath a night sky, listening to whispers that time has tried to bury. This is not a hurried tale, but a meditative unfolding, an invitation to sit with the silence, to feel the weight of memory, and perhaps to find in it a quiet reflection of ourselves. Stay a while. Let the night carry you into the echoes of history as we begin. Trail of Tears, the forced removal of Native Americans. Before history wrote its darkest lines, there was a time of stillness, when the land breathed quietly with its people. Across rolling hills and dense forests, in valleys where rivers coiled like veins of life, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole lived in a rhythm that stretched back through countless generations. They did not see themselves as owners of the earth, but as children of it. The land was mother and teacher, the rivers carried not just water but memory, and the trees stood as guardians whispering stories older than time. Life was woven with balance, every hunt accompanied by gratitude, every harvest by ritual, every birth by song, and every death by reverence. Imagine a night in those years. A fire burns low inside a circle of stones. The stars above shine without interruption, unbroken by city lights, vast and immeasurable. Round the fire, voices murmur, some soft with prayer, others strong with story. Children curl beside their mothers, listening to tales of creation, of spirits that walk with the living, of ancestors whose footsteps still echo through the earth. There is laughter, there is warmth, there is a sense of belonging deeper than language. This was not paradise, for hardship always lived beside joy, but it was a world of meaning, a life where the pulse of the people beat in harmony with the land. These nations, often called the Five Civilized Tribes by outsiders, carried cultures rich with art, governance, and tradition. They were builders of homes and keepers of law, farmers who tended fertile fields of corn and beans, hunters who followed the migration of deer, and teachers who passed wisdom from elder to child. Their lives flowed not in isolation, but in communities of connection, where every person was part of something larger, something sacred. And though the future would bring storms that tore at these bonds, in this moment before colonization's weight pressed upon them, there was stillness. There was peace. The land itself seemed to mirror their existence. In spring, blossoms dressed the meadows in delicate color, while rivers swelled with snow melt, singing of renewal. In summer, the forest grew dense with life, a living cathedral of green, where the air itself felt alive. Autumn painted the hillsides in fire red and golden hues, marking the cycle of time and change. And winter, though harsh, wrapped the people in rituals of endurance, of gathering, of patience. Through each season, the people moved with rhythm, never above nature, always within it. Yet even as harmony filled their days, beyond the ocean another world stirred. Ships were being built, maps were being drawn, and a hunger for land, a hunger that could never be satisfied, was beginning to awaken. But here, in these early years, there was no shadow yet cast upon the earth, only stories, only footsteps, only the sound of drums carrying into the night like a heartbeat. For the Cherokee and their neighbors, the world was not divided by lines of ownership, but by flows of relationship. The rivers were not property, they were kin. The soil was not a resource, it was life itself. To take more than one needed was to wound the balance, to dishonor the sacred bond. In this way, they live with restraint, with respect, and with deep memory of those who came before. Close your eyes and imagine it now. A night without the hum of machines, without the glare of neon, without the restless noise of cities. Only the cicada singing in chorus, only the flicker of firelight on faces, only the steady breath of a world still whole. It is into this world, quiet, reverent, untouched, that our story begins. For soon everything would change. Soon, the land that had been a cradle of memory would become a battlefield of power. Soon, the gentle balance of culture and nature would fracture under the heavy hand of colonization. But before that storm arrives, let us linger a little longer here, in the stillness, in the simplicity, in the fragile beauty of what once was. Because to understand the sorrow that followed, we must first feel the harmony that was lost. And so, as the firelight dims and the night deepens, we hold in our minds this image of peace, knowing it will make the coming shadows all the more profound. And thus the stage is set, the silence before the storm, the heartbeat before it falters. From this quiet beginning, the story of the Trail of Tears slowly awakens. The silence of the old world did not last forever. Across the ocean, nations of Europe were growing restless, their eyes searching outward, hungry for land and for promise. When their ships arrived on the shores of a vast continent, they carried not only goods for trade, but the weight of ambition. At first, the encounters seemed small, strangers meeting strangers, hands extended with gifts, cautious smiles shared across different languages. Yet beneath the surface of these meetings lay seeds of imbalance, seeds that would grow into shadows stretching across generations. For the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole, the first contact was met with curiosity. Who were these people, with skin so pale, clothing so heavy, and tools made of strange, shining metal? They brought objects never before seen, firearms that thundered, beads of glass that caught the light, and papers filled with markings no one here could read. To some, these things appeared wondrous, to others, unsettling. But curiosity turned, slowly, into unease. The newcomers spoke often of land, as if it were something that could be owned, divided, and sold. This idea was foreign, almost unthinkable, to those whose lives were tied to the rivers and forests, not as possessions, but as living kin. At first, the settlers came in trickles, small groups, families seeking farmland, traders moving along rivers. But soon the trickle became a flood. Villages that once rested in quiet harmony found themselves pressed by the growing tide of strangers. Forests were cut, rivers were redirected, fields were claimed. With each passing year, the space for the native people grew smaller, their hunting grounds disappearing, their sacred places disturbed. The land that had always stretched endless and open began to close in, shrinking beneath the weight of another world's hunger. And with the settlers came not only tools and trade, but laws. Laws written in languages the native people did not speak, enforced by authorities they did not recognize. Agreements were signed with words that promised friendship, but behind them lingered intentions far colder. A treaty might speak of peace, yet soon after, another would be broken. The Cherokee began to see that promises from these new rulers were as fragile as smoke, vanishing as soon as they were spoken. The growing nation of the United States looked westward with eyes full of desire. Politicians in faraway cities debated the Indian question as if human lives could be reduced to policy, as if ancient nations could be erased with ink on paper. The language they used was polished, wrapped in talk of progress and civilization, But to the native tribes, progress meant displacement, and civilization meant the unraveling of their way of life. Tensions deepened. Farmers found their crops stolen by settlers who claimed the soil now belonged to them. Families woke to find fences cutting through their hunting paths. Elders who once guided their communities with wisdom now faced the despair of watching tradition slip away. Resentment grew on both sides, settlers who saw the natives as obstacles, and natives who saw settlers as intruders upon a sacred balance. Even before open conflict, the quiet violence had begun. It lived in the erosion of dignity, in the constant pressure of being pushed aside, in the slow breaking of trust. Each broken treaty was a wound, each lost piece of land a fracture in the heart of a people, and though the storm of war had not yet come, the skies were already darkening. Close your eyes and imagine that unease. Imagine standing on land your ancestors walked for centuries, watching strangers claim it with papers you cannot read, their soldiers standing nearby with weapons at the ready. Imagine knowing that the soil beneath your feet, the very soil that carries your history, your stories, your belonging, is being taken piece by piece while your voice is ignored. It was not yet the trail of tears, not yet the forced marches and endless suffering, but the path toward it had begun, slow and steady, as surely as a river carves its way through stone. What started with curiosity had become intrusion. What began with cautious friendship had turned into dominance. And for the Cherokee and their neighbors, there was a quiet dawning realization. This was not a passing storm. This was the beginning of a conflict that would stretch through generations, reshaping not only the land, but the soul of a people. And so, as the shadows lengthened, the stage was set for resistance, a struggle that would rise in battles both spoken and fought, leading into the first sparks of war. Conflict does not always begin with the clash of weapons. Often it begins in silence, through words ignored, promises broken, and dignity denied. For the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole, the first resistance to colonization was not with arrows or muskets, but with determination. They negotiated. They pleaded. They tried to adapt, to coexist, to prove that they were not enemies but neighbors. They built schools, learned the English language, established governments patterned after the United States itself. They hoped that by showing their civility, their right to remain on their lands would be honored. But history is heavy with irony. The very success of the tribes in adapting only made their lands more desirable. The fields they cultivated with rich harvests, the towns they built with order and law. These became prizes too tempting for settlers who saw only property, not people. And so, when words failed, when petitions to Congress fell on deaf ears, resistance turned into something more. The Creek War, the Seminole Wars, the many scattered battles across southern soil. These were the flames that sparked when desperation met oppression. Small villages rose in defiance. Warriors painted for battle stood against soldiers carrying banners of a growing empire. Yet these were not equal battles. The United States, with its organized armies and endless reinforcements, struck with force that native warriors could not match. Muskets cracked against bows, cannons thundered against shields of wood and spirit. The imbalance was clear, yet still, the people resisted. Imagine the cries that filled those forests, the war drums beating in the night, the shouts of warriors defending not conquest, but survival. Their families waited in silence, praying for the return of fathers, brothers, sons who may never walk back through the village paths. Every skirmish carried not only blood but memory, the memory of a people refusing to vanish without a voice. The Creek fought fiercely in the Red Stick War, till the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, where General Andrew Jackson led U.S. troops to victory in a massacre that would haunt history. The Seminoles resisted removal with a defiance that stretched over decades, retreating into swamps, striking with sudden raids, disappearing into the mist. The Cherokee tried another path, turning to courts, to treaties, to appeals for justice. But even there, their voices were drowned out by the roar of expansion. Each defeat left scars deeper than the battlefield. Entire villages burned, families scattered, leaders killed or imprisoned. Treaties signed under duress stripped more land away, leaving the tribes with shrinking ground to stand upon. The wars were not only of weapons, but of endurance, of trying to hold on to an identity while the world pressed relentlessly against them. And yet, amidst the ashes of loss, something unbreakable lingered. The spirit of resistance was not measured in victories, but in survival. Even when beaten back, even when forced to sign away sacred lands, the people carried within them an ember of defiance. They knew the price of surrender was more than territory. It was the erasure of memory, the silencing of ancestors, the vanishing of all that made them who they were. And so they fought. Not always with armies, but with endurance, with culture, with stories told in secret, with songs sung softly at night so the next generation would remember. Close your eyes and hear that heartbeat, the rhythm of defiance. The wars may have been lost on the battlefield, but in the quiet spaces of survival, something continued. Mothers whispered history into the ears of children. Elders recited lineages so the past would not be forgotten. Warriors who returned carried scars not just of the body, but of the soul. This was the first great clash, the moment when the tribes realized that their struggle was not temporary, not a passing storm, but a long war for existence itself. The first wars against the encroaching United States were not only battles for land, but battles for dignity, identity, and the right to remain. And from these defeats, from these ashes of broken treaties and smoldering villages, the story moved toward another chapter, where paper, signatures, and law would wound more deeply than even muskets and cannons could. Defeat on the battlefield did not end the struggle. In many ways, it only shifted the stage. Where once the clash of muskets and war cries echoed through forests and swamps, now the conflict moved into courtrooms, council halls, and the ink-stained pages of treaties. The wars had weakened the tribes, leaving them scarred and scattered, but they were not destroyed. Instead, they sought another path: survival through negotiation, dignity through law, and protection through promises written on fragile parchment. But those promises were built on sand. The United States, expanding ever westward, saw treaties not as sacred bonds, but as tools, temporary measures to pacify tribes until their lands could be claimed in full. Each new agreement seemed to take more than the last. A line drawn on a map here, a boundary shifted there, a clause misunderstood, a promise reworded, a signature taken under duress. The Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole found themselves trapped in a web of legal language designed not to preserve their homes, but to dismantle them piece by piece. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 became the turning point. Signed by President Andrew Jackson, it carried the weight of law and the voice of power. The act declared that the native tribes must give up their ancestral lands east of the Mississippi in exchange for land in the west, territory strange to them, far from their rivers, forests, and sacred places. To many in Congress and among settlers, this was framed as a fair trade, an opportunity for the tribes to live freely elsewhere. But to the people who had walked those lands for centuries, it was nothing less than a death sentence. Imagine the grief of an elder watching council fires dim as leaders debated the impossible choice: sign the treaty and abandon their homes, or refuse and face the full force of military removal. Some leaders, exhausted by decades of broken wars, chose the pen, hoping that at least through compliance, some lives might be spared. Others resisted, refusing to surrender what had been given to them by ancestors and the Creator. The division among the tribes themselves deepened the wounds, turning neighbor against neighbor as the pressure of colonization fractured even the bonds of kinship. The Cherokee turned to the highest courts, fighting with words instead of weapons. They argued that they were a sovereign nation, protected by treaties the United States had already signed. And in 1832, the Supreme Court in Worcester versus Georgia agreed with them, declaring that the Cherokee Nation was indeed a distinct community, and that the laws of Georgia had no force within its borders. It was, for a moment, a rare glimmer of justice. Yet President Jackson himself is said to have dismissed the ruling, famously declaring that the court had made its decision but could not enforce it. And with that, even law bowed to power. So the treaties continued, one after another, each more devastating than the last. The Treaty of New Akota, signed in 1835 by a small faction of Cherokee without the consent of their people, sealed the fate of thousands. It gave legal cover to what was already in motion, the forced removal of entire nations from their homes. To those who opposed it, the treaty was nothing more than a betrayal, a false document born of coercion. But for the government, it was enough. Enough to justify the march that would follow. Picture the moment after the ink dried. Families gathered their few belongings, unsure of what awaited them. Soldiers stood nearby, their presence a constant reminder that refusal meant violence. Leaders who once walked proudly among their people now carried the weight of shame, their voices breaking as they told their children they must leave behind the graves of their ancestors, the rivers where they first learned to fish, the mountains where they prayed. The war of weapons had shifted into a war of paper, and yet its wounds were just as deep. The treaties did not simply move borders, they moved lives, tearing roots from soil, tearing memory from place. The people were being written out of their own land, erased not with gunpowder this time, but with ink. And so, step by step, law by law, the path toward the Trail of Tears was paved. Not suddenly, not all at once, but through the slow erosion of rights, through the steady breaking of trust, through the cruel certainty of power pressing against the powerless. And from these treaties, from these forced signatures and hollow promises, the next chapter of sorrow began, the march itself, where the land would weep with the footsteps of the displaced, and the cries of the suffering would echo into history. The march westward was not simply a journey. It was a wound opened across the land, one that bled sorrow with every step. For the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole, the Trail of Tears was not a single event, but a season of endless grief. Families uprooted, villages emptied, voices silenced beneath the command of soldiers. The removal was meant to be orderly, almost clinical, but reality was cruel. Thousands were forced to walk hundreds of miles, carrying what little they could, their possessions reduced to bundles tied with cloth, their futures uncertain, their past slipping further behind them with every footfall. The journey was marked by hunger. Provisions promised by the government rarely arrived, and when they did, they were meager, spoiled, or insufficient. Children cried from empty stomachs, their voices thin in the winter air. Mothers held them close, offering comfort they themselves no longer felt. The elderly stumbled under the weight of fatigue, many collapsing along the roadside, their bodies left behind, because the march could not wait. Soldiers, pressed with orders, drove the people forward like cattle, with little regard for those who fell. Cold was another enemy. The winters were merciless, winds cutting through worn blankets, snow settling upon bare feet. Fires were difficult to keep alive, and many nights entire groups shivered under the sky, praying for the sun to rise. Illness spread quickly: cholera, pneumonia, fever, striking the weak and strong alike. Once one child coughed, another soon followed, and soon families found themselves burying more than one. Graves dotted the path westward, shallow mounds of earth hurriedly covered, sometimes marked with a stone, sometimes left anonymous in the frozen soil. And in this endless march, grief became constant. Imagine the sound of mourning: a mother wailing for a child she could not save, a husband holding the still body of his wife, elders whispering final prayers as their strength gave out. The trail was not quiet. It was filled with the sounds of suffering, and yet, over time, even those cries dulled, as exhaustion swallowed what little energy remained. Silence replaced lament, numbness replaced tears. People walked with hollow eyes, bodies moving through their spirits lagged behind. It was not only bodies that perished along the trail, but hopes. Entire generations were scarred. Children who survived grew up with memories of hunger and displacement, their sense of safety fractured forever. Families torn apart by death carried wounds that would echo in their descendants. The loss was more than physical, it was cultural, spiritual, generational. Songs once sung freely around fires fell silent, ceremonies interrupted, traditions disrupted. The land itself, so deeply tied to their identity, was left behind. And in leaving, something essential was severed, a cord binding people to place, broken with no way to mend. Imagine the despair of a father watching his children stumble, knowing the stories he once told them of sacred mountains, of rivers teeming with life, no longer had a home. Imagine the quiet sorrow of an elder realizing the graves of ancestors had been abandoned, left to strangers or to neglect. These were not simply losses of territory. They were losses of belonging, of continuity, of meaning itself. Yet, even in this devastation, there flickered embers of survival. Mothers whispered language to their children, refusing to let words vanish. Elders shared stories under the stars so that memory would outlive geography. Songs were sung softly, sometimes in defiance, sometimes as comfort, echoing through the night like fragile threads binding past to future. The people carried more than grief. They carried resilience. They endured because not enduring would mean complete erasure. Still, the cost was unbearable. Estimates say thousands died along the trail, their names remembered in fragments, their lives reduced to statistics in history books. But to their families, each was irreplaceable. A child with laughter lost, a mother with wisdom gone, a grandfather with stories untold. Each death was not just a number, but a rupture, a light extinguished from a community already stumbling in darkness. This was the generational wound, the tearing apart of continuity, the fracturing of families, the silencing of voices that should have carried forward. A wound so deep it would echo for centuries, shaping identity, shaping sorrow, shaping the story of what it meant to be native in the shadow of colonization. And so, from hunger, from loss, from broken generations, the Trail of Tears did not end with arrival. It lingered, etched into memory, a scar carried forward. And as we move toward the final reflection, we begin to see how these wounds did not simply belong to the past, but still breathe within the present. The Trail of Tears did not end when the final footsteps reached the western lands. It did not end when the last families were forced to cross rivers or when the last soldiers turned back to their garrisons. The trail remained, not on the maps, but in the hearts of those who survived. For them, the journey was more than distance. It was the measure of loss, of memory, of sorrow carved into the very core of existence. And though generations have passed, its echo still lingers, soft but unbroken, like the wind through empty fields. In the quiet of reflection, we see that the trail was not only a tragedy of the 19th century, it was a story about what power can do to the powerless, what greed can do to the innocent, and what silence can do to truth. Laws, armies, and policies may have forced the march, but it was human lives, children, mothers, elders that bore its cost. Each death was not simply an ending, but a stolen future. Each mile walked in suffering was a reminder of how fragile dignity can be when confronted by unchecked power. Yet, in remembering, we also witness resilience. The Cherokee Nation still lives. The Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole endure. Though their lands are taken, their cultures survive. Songs once nearly silenced are sung again. Languages once fading are being taught to children once more. Ceremonies, dances, prayers, all still exist, carried like sacred embers through the darkness of time. The people remain, proof that even the deepest wounds cannot erase the heartbeat of identity. Survival itself became a form of resistance, a refusal to let the past have the final word. Still, the memory of the trail is not gentle. It asks us to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge a sorrow that is both historic and ongoing. For the descendants of those who walked, the trauma is not distant. It is woven into stories told at family tables, into the absence of land that once held ancestors, into the knowledge that history books cannot fully carry their grief. For those who listen today, the trail becomes a mirror, reflecting back the responsibility of remembrance. Close your eyes and imagine standing on a quiet road at dusk. The air is still, the sky painted in soft shades of fading light. You feel the ground beneath your feet, and if you listen closely enough, you might almost hear them, the footsteps of thousands, moving in sorrow, moving in silence, moving because they were given no choice. Their voices do not call out loudly, but they whisper through time, asking not to be forgotten. The lesson of the Trail of Tears is not locked in the past. It reaches forward, reminding us to guard against injustice wherever it appears, to question power when it threatens humanity, to see the dignity of all people as sacred. It teaches us that what was done once, under the cloak of law and order, can happen again if memory fades. To remember is to resist repetition. To forget is to risk allowing history to breathe again in new forms of suffering. And so, as we let this story rest for tonight, we carry with us both the sorrow and the strength. Sorrow for the thousands lost, for the children who never grew, for the elders who never reached their destination. Strength for the survival of those who endured, for the voices that continue to rise, for the culture that refused to vanish. The Trail of Tears is not only a chapter of American history, it is a human story, one that belongs to all of us. It is a reminder that the earth remembers every step, that justice delayed can still echo, and that healing requires honesty. May we listen, may we remember, and may we walk forward differently, with gentleness upon the lands we inherit, and with reverence for the lives that came before. And so, the story closes, not with an ending, but with a lingering echo, soft, sorrowful, resilient, carried like a quiet song into the night, beneath the stars that have always watched and always remembered